so excited to share this episode with you, a conversation with Amy Wilkinson. Amy is a dance maker, activist, scholar, and professor. This is our second episode of the role of art in our growth, soul, and human experience. We're talking all things dance, from Amy's entry into the dance world and her love of performance, questioning the teaching paradigms in which she was trained in, and the social structures that perpetuate oppression, how we can use dance to serve people. We also touch on the problems of social media, what it means to be a fully embodied human, self-critiquing, body image and body politics, fears of failure, dance's role in our human experience, and the current threats to the arts at large. I want to keep this intro short, but we definitely get pretty deep, but that's kind of why this conversation is long. And I didn't necessarily want to break this conversation up because I want to give you the opportunity to listen to it all the way through and go on this conversational journey that Amy and I went on. As Amy was my professor in college, that naturally yielded itself to such a beautiful and thought-provoking conversation and discussion. On top of the fact that Amy is an artist, an activist, and speaks my language in that sense as well. I hope you enjoy and find all the golden nuggets of wisdom that are strewn throughout this conversation. Do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. My name is Amy Wilkinson, and I am a professional dance maker and an educator and a dance scholar based in Chicago.
I met Amy my senior year of college when I got lucky enough that she taught my jazz 1 class, like introductory jazz class, and then I took ballet with her the next semester. Yeah, my final semester. So I had the privilege of experiencing Amy as a teacher and her whole teaching philosophy, which we'll talk about because I think it's unique, and in my opinion, it's so valuable, and I would love to see more people incorporate your teaching philosophy. Okay, tell me about your experience with dance. Like, how did you get started? When did you start dancing?
One of the things that I think created space for that in my life when I was young was that I grew up in a very artistic family. Both my parents were musicians, both singers. My dad was a composer, and so there was always sort of this openness and a real encouragement around the arts, which I think is not always the case in families, right? My extended family too, my grandmother was an artist, her mother was an artist, my great aunt was the visual artist. On the other side of my family, my grandparents on my mom's side were professional singers. So there was just, I grew up in a family that was sort of steeped in the arts and that appreciated the arts. So I think that foundation was maybe a significant part of my enthusiasm.
Yeah.
But I also think that at an early age, I was actually thinking about this in preparation for our conversation. When I was a kid, a little girl, I was kind of a hero worshiper. So when I saw people on stage, they were, that was like what they did seemed heroic to me. You know, they seemed 10 feet tall.
Yeah.
They seemed like magicians.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it was something. I remember seeing the Nutcracker when I was a tiny kid, sat in the front row at the Argonne Theater in Chicago, and just was like, who are these, you know, creatures? They seemed more than human somehow.
Yeah.
So I always sort of believed in theater magic and thought it was really alluring.
Mm.
And I think also that my parents saw that I had an intuitive desire to move my body, which is probably why they initially put me in little kid classes.
Yeah.
And so that's kind of where, you know, I started when I was about 6.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
And, you know, was at a very, you know, a local studio that was really keen on fostering a passion for dance rather than like a school that really emphasized serious training.
Okay. Interesting.
In specifically Western forms.
Uh-huh.
You know, in a rigorous ballet program,
right.
for example.
Right.
So when I was little, I was taking ballet, jazz, kind of creative movement type classes that just kind of fostered a love of it. You know, there was something about the music, there was something about the costumes.
Mm-hmm.
And then I'll say that really when I first fell in love with it, I remember this moment super specifically, and I'm sure you'll get a kick out of this, Lydia. It was my first real recital, my first performance. I was 6 years old, and one of my best friends and I were performing as a duet in a larger class of probably 15 kids in the Lobster Square Dance. And I had a red polka dot skirt and a matching bow in my hair that I just thought was like so bomb.
Right.
And we were on stage in the middle of the performance, and my partner's skirt fell off in the middle of the show. And I remember a decision, you know, it was like this unified decision that we were going to keep going and just keep dancing and do the thing. And we got off stage, and the director, our teacher, said, she complimented us and said, I'm so proud of you for not stopping, for you know, keeping the show going. And it was a moment where I thought it was like in my little kid way. I wouldn't have been able to articulate this at the time, but it was like I was part of something bigger than myself.
Yeah.
It was this feeling of like being connected. You know, we had a responsibility to everyone, to the audience, to the rest of the students in the class, to just make this thing happen. And it felt like there was that connection there. And so I think that sparked also a sense in me that art making and dance specifically was this opportunity to create connections.
Yeah.
And then the other thing that I'll say is that when I was about 8, I had a speaking line in a musical, and I practiced it all through the rehearsal process, you know, in this community theater group, you know, in sort of just a very typical way that an 8-year-old would recite a line.
Right.
I was kind of supposed to be kind of a little. My character was sort of an annoying little kid.
Okay.
But I would say this line in rehearsal in sort of just a regular way.
Mm-hmm.
And my first night on stage, I don't know what came over me, but I stood up in this like incredibly dramatic way and marched to the front of the stage, which I had not done ever in rehearsal.
Yeah.
And just like, it was Shakespearean. My delivery was like Shakespearean. And the audience laughed. And I remember at that moment thinking, this is power. Like, I have power.
Mm-hmm.
I was so shocked that I could elicit a reaction from people. And I loved that feeling so much. And I think at that moment, I realized not only was dance like this opportunity or performing this opportunity to connect with people, but that I could own a certain kind of power inside myself. And I
Yeah.
think that was another thing that sort of drove my future interests in it.
Incredible. I mean, so much of that is like, first, I think for a parent, and clearly it sounds like in your family that it was natural that this would happen, but for a parent to be able to recognize in a child something early on that they could have a passion for and interest for, and being able to like nurture that in the way your parents did, that's incredible and seemed pretty spot on.
Yeah, I mean, I think it was, it was one of those combinations of nature and nurture.
Right.
I think I had some natural proclivities
Yeah.
towards it, and it was also the environment that I was raised in, so
Right.
those things kind of were synergistic in that way.
Totally. How then do you feel your relationship with dance and performance evolved as you got older, you got deeper into the professionalism of it, being a professional dancer and then teaching it?
Yeah, my relationship with dance as an art form has changed almost entirely over the course of my professional performing career and making career and teaching career.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I think, you know, one of the things that was valuable for me as a dancer, as a young dancer, was the discipline and the authority. And I
Mm-hmm.
responded in a lot of ways to discipline and authority that were very much a part of my initial training.
Mm-hmm.
And like I said, I was a hero worshiper and sort of
Yeah.
a people, I there was sort of a people pleaser element to the way that I studied dance. My teachers
Mm.
were like, again, they were like personal heroes to me.
Right.
Someone who had a professional performance career. I was just totally enamored by
Mm-hmm.
them. They were these superhuman creatures that I aspired to be.
Right.
And so my work was often motivated, getting better was often motivated by their approval,
Mm-hmm.
by their support,
Mm-hmm.
by their encouragement. Um, and I, I think at the same time, I also started to develop tools and strategies. So for example, you know, for myself, I realized I would say at a fairly early age that I was capable of watching someone and being able to discern certain qualities in that person's performance or certain qualities in that person's approach
Okay.
that I
Yeah.
could take it on as my own.
Fascinating. How old, like, if
And
you could pinpoint how old you were when you were able
I
to do that?
definitely honed that technique while I was in college,
Okay.
where I would scope out the best person in the room and
Yeah.
emulate that person.
Got it.
And
Okay.
I learned how to kind of play these roles or how to take on these characteristics.
Yeah.
But even as a kid, I mean, I was actually looking at a picture of myself as a kid the other day, and I remember one girl in my first class who I
Mm-hmm.
had identified in my mind as the best one, the girl to
Mm.
beat in the class.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember for years she was kind of a friend of me in the sense that I admired her. I thought to myself, this girl is really something.
Yeah.
I need to be like her,
Yeah.
and that motivating me to work hard.
Mm-hmm.
And so there was there was an element of competition. I think there was
Yeah.
also an element of this wanting to please people,
Right.
um, of wanting of responding to discipline and responding
Mm-hmm.
to rules and structure that I
Mm-hmm.
think were very much a part of the kind of training that I grew up in.
Yeah.
As I got older, I started to interrogate, those structures and those
Mm-hmm.
strategies and those power dynamics because I
Mm.
started to realize that owning my voice as an independent artist and an art maker required significant trust in myself, and I
Yeah.
had to sort of think about and question what I was being motivated by.
Mm-hmm.
And I had enough, a variety of experiences working with various professional organizations that taught me a lot about leadership, that taught me a lot about the artistic process. And I started to kind of rethink the ways that dance could serve people in terms of creative expression and connections,
Yeah.
connections to community.
Mm-hmm.
I think also simultaneously, as I was sort of reflecting on my own experiences with dance growing up,
Right.
I was also in an academic program at the time. This was, still while I was dancing professionally, that really asked me to reflect on social structures that perpetuate inequality and perpetuate oppression.
Yeah.
And so I started to ask myself questions about, dance training and how the kinds of language that we use, the behaviors that we use, the expectations, the norms, the culture around dance training, how all of that sort of fits into larger structures around white supremacy, around misogyny and sort of authoritarianism. And I started to recognize sort of some of these political elements of dance, and realized that I wanted to undo some of that. So in that quest, I think my teaching evolved, my approach to art making has evolved significantly, and sort of my understanding of dance's role in society has all evolved significantly over that time.
Right. If you could, and I know this is probably not easy, if you could sum up that landing point, where you've landed in terms of that, how would you describe that?
The answer that I'll give you is probably one that is just like so specific to the time that, to this moment.
Yeah.
So, ask me a year from now and maybe my answer would be different.
Of course.
Or ask me, 6 months ago and my answer would be different. But I think one of the things that I have tried, that one of the fundamental pieces that I'm realizing about dance is that it creates an opportunity for people to experience a full self, body, mind, spirit. One of the things that I think our society is not great at is acknowledging the knowledge that is housed in our bodies.
100%.
We dismiss embodied knowledge as something less valuable than the intellect.
Yeah.
Or less valuable than numerical data.
Right.
And I think that's a shame and a travesty in terms of our ability to connect to each other and connect with our environment, to connect to the greater world.
Yeah, 100%.
So I think dance is an opportunity for that, to experience our full selves. And that's sort of where my teaching and my dance practice aims to focus on. The other part of it is that I think people are longing to be seen. It's not just experience, the experience of embodiment is transformative in and of itself.
Right.
Having that experience sort of independently of anybody else witnessing it is valuable in and of itself. But I also think that humans crave a witness to our lives. And dance also provides that. Some of the most transformative and powerful moments I've had as a teacher or as an art maker is being able to say to someone, I see you. I see the work that you're doing.
Mm-hmm.
I see you struggling with this.
Mm-hmm.
I see your embrace of, this, or I see your resistance to this.
Mm-hmm.
And I want you to know that I acknowledge that, and I think being seen, in addition to feeling it internally, being
Right.
seen by and witnessed by others is a really powerful experience that dance provides. So I think it's those two things.
Yeah.
The whole self being activated and present,
Mm-hmm.
and then the opportunity for that self to be witnessed by others.
100%. Do you think part of that as well? I just recorded an episode talking about the attention economy. You know, there's so many people trying to get our attention, especially online, and there's also a craving of attention. Do you think that dance can help almost, right, like soothe that aspect of invalidate? We all do want to be seen, and perhaps dance provides, I don't even want to say productive, because I think that then, negates some of the other productive ways that we can be seen, but it provides that outlet in a healthy way.
I love the way I love the way that you're framing that idea of the attention economy, because I do think that this is something that we are sort of intuitively at war with, right? That like many, many, many of us have a love-hate relationship with social media, right? In the sense that it provides a platform to communicate, and it also sort of strips the intimacy away from communication in a lot of ways, right? Like this idea of like an endless number of friends. What does the word friend really mean?
Yeah.
Or a billion likes. What does like actually mean? Or what does view actually? You've got a billion views on this video. What does a view actually mean? What is the meaning of it? And this is the dance, the professional dance world, and even the amateur dance world and the competition dance world. All you have to do is click on Instagram to see a bazillion stories and a bazillion images that sort of feed into exactly what you're talking about, this attention economy. And I myself find that super problematic in the way that it bumps up against the two things that I'm talking about, which is an embodied experience and being witnessed. Because I think what I'm talking about in terms of those things is a deeper, more robust way of feeling and knowing and seeing than what we typically get via social media platforms.
Yeah.
So in the sense that, maybe this is like another example, but the term self-care has sort of been co-opted by capitalism in a lot of ways, right? Like self-care is a whole market in and of itself, right? But there's something really meaningful at the heart of self-care. Right?
Yep.
And I think that idea of performativity is also, or being seen, wanting to be witnessed, craving attention. There's also sort of this surface level or co-opting of that at the societal level. But I think a really, the hard work result of a real dance practice results in something much deeper and much more meaningful.
Yeah.
So I guess the long-winded answer to your question is yes, dance can get at that.
Yeah.
Get at that need and that desire, that human desire to be witnessed and to be seen, but at a much more deeper and fulfilling level, I think, than how we typically encounter or address that need.
Totally. Totally. I think also part of it too, again, I think self-care is actually a really interesting example of it. Actually, probably better said, like, about embodiment and what it means to experience the knowledge of our bodies and to live in our bodies, not just in our minds, not just through technology. We're not taught about that. We're really not. And so, you're lucky when you're exposed to certain things like dance that will teach you that, or yoga, that bring you into your body in a way that you might not experience otherwise. And that's, I mean, and then it even goes into like something like self-care, where it's something again we're not taught about, but yet is so essential to our functioning.
Yeah, and I appreciate your question about how things changed for me, because I do want to acknowledge that for a lot of people, dance training, I hear this from students all the time, that dance training can do the opposite of what I'm talking
Yeah,
about. A lot of people have experiences with trauma. First of
right.
all, acknowledging that our bodies house knowledge, our bodies also house trauma.
Yeah.
So, I think recognizing that the body knows, but the body knows all kinds of things that we don't give it credit for. It knows joy, it knows pleasure,
Right.
it also knows deep pain and
Right.
wounding.
Have you read The Body Keeps the Score?
No, I haven't.
It's such a great book. It's by a leading trauma psychologist and researcher, and it's literally talking about everything that, you just said.
Yeah, I think that for many people, dance is actually the way that we've traditionally trained it,
Yeah.
and particularly in Western,
Yeah.
in Western cultures, the way that we've often trained it is oppressive. And so that's, I think, what the changing in the way that I look at dance, the opportunities in dance, have changed over the years. But I do want to acknowledge that for some people, traditional methods of training, and not for everybody, not everybody feels impressed by traditional methods of training, but there are many people that do.
Yeah.
And so I think it's about using, just like, again, like you would use social media. It's a tool that can be wielded for good and for ill. And I think it's part of it's our best interest to sort of discern what methods and what strategies can be used to support the biggest number of people who are seeking fulfillment through those kinds of practices.
Yeah.
But I think, to your original point, there's this great Sir Ken Robinson quote about how children are educated primarily from the neck up and slightly to one side. In the sense that there is a hierarchy of knowledge, that we prioritize certain ways of knowing the world, and the body is not one of them.
Yeah.
And that, the knowledge that's housed in the body is often negated. So I would wholeheartedly agree that we are sort of educated out of our awareness and our embodiment.
Right. And, part of what I hear as I am doing the beta test for Reself is that, people echoing back that disconnect from their body and trying to learn how to connect again with themselves in that way. And, being able to hopefully provide people a framework that helps with that is obviously one of my, is very important to me. And again, like with everything, awareness, even having that awareness of that neck up education. And I like that I've heard like neck up before, but even just the to the one side is so, having that awareness and being able to reflect on the ways that impacts us. Like you said, even having an awareness that was able to give you a different framework and understanding of your experience growing up and coming up through dance into your professional careers. It can be life altering in very positive ways.
Definitely. I think there's so much learning and unlearning that happens. I don't think that that it's always necessarily a straight line or a trajectory, a clear trajectory. I feel like I'm still learning and unlearning
Same.
now. Which is maybe why it's like it's hard to say I've landed on like the end all be all
Right.
philosophy, but yeah, I think for this moment in time, it's it. I kind of see that as really important, if not the most important thing right now.
Yeah. No, that's so insightful, I think, for a lot of people, especially even conversations around unlearning. Again, something I don't think that we talk about that is equally, if not, I mean, who's to say it's more important, but it's an equal part of continually learning as a human and growing uh, in all aspects, right?
For sure.
Um, so this is something I'm curious to talk to you about. My experience with dance prior to having some sort of like a structured dance class and
I would
training.
love to hear it, Lydia.
So I mean, like you, like I'm a hero worshiper. I can totally relate to that. And I think there's a lot of productive things that come of that. And for me, one of those things was dance when I was younger. And I never, like, I played tennis and soccer very competitively. So there was no space for that. And I also think it just wasn't something that was valued by, like, my family or my parents or my community in certain ways. But I had friends that took dance classes. And I thought that it was so cool the way that they could move their bodies. And I just, like, as a kid and even, now, like, I love to dance. In the morning, I put music on and I dance myself into a happy place. And it's just energizing and ecstatic. But then I took a dance class and it was such a different experience where obviously it's not that in the moment improvisational. You're learning a technique, you're doing choreography. And for me, especially in the beginning, that was hard. At that point in my life, again, I was a senior in college. So I was aware of my perfectionist tendencies. And it was a brilliant practice of releasing those and surrendering to being a beginner and holding that space for myself to do that. But I used to joke with Amy in my ballet class all the time. I'm living my 4-year-old dream because I always, I was just so fascinated with ballerinas. Maybe, I mean, as other girls are culturally, raised to kind of be. So, part of it was I was living this experience of something I always just wanted to do. And for people that have those things in their life, but they don't do them, I think there's so much to be said for, again, surrendering to being a beginner and just jumping into it because I mean, what's the point? Otherwise you're going to die and then you never did it. And there's that regret. Just do that experience and we learn from it. But anyways, it was nothing like dancing in my room to my favorite music or dancing with friends out. And that was kind of hard. And I wonder, I mean, obviously, I first wonder, what your takeaway from that is, but I also wonder what your experience with that is. Do you find that when you, and I don't know how to frame this. Do you find that when you dance in your house, you dance with your children, your husband, your friends, do you find that to be a different experience and sensation than when you do choreography and perform?
Very much so. And first, I want to go back to your initial point, which is that, number one, I so heartily commend your approach and ability to sort of shed those expectations, because I think for a lot of folks who idealize or
Yeah.
sort of fantasize about, the idea of being a dancer. I mean, there's something sort of romantic,
Of course.
about that notion, and particularly about ballet, because all of the, classical ballets, the stories revolve around magic and romance, and so we kind of, and the bodies, the facility, the costuming. I mean, there's something so, the word I keep coming back to is magic. There's something magical, and I think the expectations a lot of the time are, as if you're taking a class, you're coming in to take a class for the first time, you're sort of wanting to tap into that magic.
Right.
That's something that I think students often are kind of looking for. And the reality is that that learning something new is a huge risk. I mean, it's a huge emotional risk. It can involve physical risk when dance is concerned, especially because you're asking your body to do things that your body is not used to doing.
Yeah.
And it is also, learning a specific codified technique, which is essentially the opposite of what you're talking about when you are feeling free and dancing to music in your room. When you are learning a certain codified technique, often the pathway to do that is essentially rooted in disciplining the body. Where we are spending huge amounts of effort to discipline the body. It requires self-surveillance. It requires the surveillance of others. And I think this is one of the reasons why dance training often triggers trauma for people, because the way that we traditionally teach it and some of just the fundamentals of learning a codified language require these adherence to certain rules or principles. And that can feel quite stifling when we also think about the other side of dance, which is, human expression, communication, creativity, etc.
Yeah.
And I think, I myself in my teaching practice have struggled years and years to sort of find a balance between those, what often feel like two opposing forces. That sense of like, how can we play around with, and I think, well, I'll say it this way. One of the ways that I've started to talk about dance training is to talk about it in terms of play. So when I teach classes now, I never say, you need to pull in your core muscles and you need to hold your arms like this. I rarely, if ever, use language like that. What I'll say now is, you know what, this technique gives us an opportunity to explore what it feels like in our bodies to engage our latissimus dorsi in this way. This moment, this thing that we're doing, this port de bras that we're doing right now, this is an opportunity to play around with the feeling of strength across our backs. What does that feel like for you?
Right.
And so I think even in that language, it's triggering this idea that, hey, we have some ownership and agency and choice in how we approach this material. But again, it is, I think all of that is like a process of learning and unlearning, because our expectations are often, based on our ideas of how teaching should be. We often feel like, hey, I'm the student, the teacher should be giving me all the answers. And, a lot of people thrive in, or feel that they thrive in a situation where there are really clear-cut rules. And black and white rules.
Right.
And it can be really hard to unlearn sort of that expectation that there are clear rules that you can achieve. I think that factors in a great deal with the idea of perfectionism. Because if there's a correct way to do something, it means that there's a way to get there. And for it to be perfect. Right? Whereas if, there are no black and white answers, it's really hard to latch on to what that perfect is. And that can be incredibly frustrating for folks.
Yeah.
In terms of my own experience, in performance, there are certain classes and certain moments. I think the way that I've come to look at technique, whether it's in tap or jazz or ballet or hip hop or any form,
Mm-hmm.
I've come to look at it as there's sort of two things. One is that any kind of technique is a means to an end. It is not the end itself.
Yeah.
And the purpose of honing a technique is to give yourself more choices and more freedom. And you can think of this, you can think of this in terms of a meditation practice, of a yoga practice, of a lot of embodied practices where
Yeah.
the repetition and the discipline,
Mm-hmm.
the attention that you put into
Mm-hmm.
it offers, it opens more and more doors with more commitment and more
Yeah.
consistency.
100%.
But that takes time to build.
Mm-hmm.
So, there's a lot of patience and forgiveness that are required, and kind of time
Yeah.
to allow those practices to really be fully realized in the body,
Mm-hmm.
and to allow those practices, once they are realized, to provide you with the freedom to choose.
Yeah.
Again, I think sometimes the way that we teach dance shuts down that freedom of choice,
Mm-hmm.
because we oftentimes use language which is like, you have to do it this way, or
Right.
this is the correct way to do
Right.
it. And so we sort of create these, I guess this is like a lot of the time in life, right? But we create these arbitrary boundaries or these arbitrary rules that we think we have to
Mm-hmm.
follow in order for something to be good.
Mm-hmm.
And then it sort of forecloses this opportunity to make choices.
Yeah.
And so I try to keep forefront in my mind that the ultimate goal of moving is to, again, have a fully human experience, and to have agency and choice.
Mm-hmm.
I often feel, in choreography and performance, in class even, I my dancing eventually, when I was at my peak, my dancing often felt like that, where I had agency, and
Okay.
I trusted my body enough. I had honed my instrument enough to be able to really tap into those things.
Yeah.
So it felt, the feeling would be very similar to when I was like at a wedding and I was just going bananas on the dance floor.
Right.
Like those feelings would be, if I were to describe them, there's a certain physical joy,
Mm-hmm.
a certain abandon,
Mm-hmm.
a certain release, a certain ownership of my physicality. All of those things I think would translate.
Yeah.
As I've, as my,
Okay. Yeah.
I think as my physical practice has been replaced by more scholarship and more teaching,
Mm-hmm.
I've lost some of that trust in my body in
Mm.
terms of sort of codified dance technique.
Mm-hmm.
And so I feel much more free. My body feels, and I feel less critical when I'm just dancing, when I'm dancing at a wedding.
Got
and when
it.
I'm dancing with my kids.
Yeah.
I can sort of access that very quickly. Whereas if I'm doing choreography, or I'm working on a phrase, or I'm, doing something that's technically rigorous, I don't have as much trust, and I don't feel that abandon like I used to.
Got it. Interesting. Fascinating. Was there ever a point when, because I think a lot of it too, it sounds like, especially with the abandon, is you're out of your head. Do you think there was a point in a reverse situation where you're dancing at a wedding, you're dancing with your kids, in that sort of like mental critic, or like moments of, you know, that aspect that you learn where it's, technique could be better, this, but obviously you're not thinking about technique, but like moments when it peaked in when it wasn't what you were doing?
I've never felt that in dance, but I've very much felt that in other places in my life.
Okay.
You know, not
Fascinating.
I would say that I've always that I've had I always had a sort of natural aptitude to accept to in those social dance in a a free social dancing, I'm just getting my groove on kind of moment. um I can't think of a time that there was ever that sort of that critic playing in my head saying you could really be doing that twerking better.
Yeah.
I can't think of a time where whereas in my professional career there were many times where I was like, oh, I could have done that pirouette better, or oh, I could have done that sequence 1,000 times better, or that partnering was really, I failed entirely at that. But that said, again, my confidence and my physicality dancing has not translated to all the other places in my life, either physical practices or otherwise. I mean, just in terms of a physical thing, like one thing that comes to mind is playing tennis. So my family would play tennis. I was never competitive. But I thought of myself, growing up as athletic, and I was a dancer, so it felt like there would be, there are a certain kind of physicality that translates.
Totally.
And so we would play tennis for fun, and oftentimes it was just fun to play tennis and hit the ball and feel like, oh, I'm kind of into it. This feels good, or I'm kind of playing well. And at times when I wasn't playing well, even though it was just free, we were just doing this to have a good time. There was no pressure. There was no formality to it. Sometimes we're not even keeping score.
Right.
But I would be, playing badly, and this critic would sort of emerge as like, what the F is wrong? Like, can you not do anything? Like, what is your problem?
Yeah.
And that's just like one little physical. That's just like one little physical thing.
Of course.
But I think what's been more damaging, is all the ways that I've critiqued myself in terms of my social interactions or my intellectual capacity.
Yeah.
In all kinds of ways. That inner critic is incredibly loud sometimes, and the most dominant voice in the room.
Yeah. 100%. You can't hear anything else if that's what you're hearing. Do you feel like, so one of the things I'm most grateful for in my tennis training was I played year round, and I practiced with coaches that would sit us down in a classroom and teach us about the mental game. And I wonder if that sort of, and I'm so grateful for that, because I think that translates into everything we do. There's that mental game of either you can critique yourself to the point of you're going to lose every set, and it's just going to be, and you're just literally smashing your racket, cursing, beating yourself up, or, with grace through your mental game, you can pull yourself back and you can have a comeback by supporting yourself. And obviously that translates, I think, beautifully into life. Do you feel like you learned that in dance at all? Or did you teach yourself that?
That is a great question. The first thing that comes to my mind is that not only, and this is, I'll start by speaking sort of distant from myself. Not only does dance sort of raise these challenges because of the way that we teach it, in the sense that, oftentimes in traditional dance teaching settings, we expect students to silently conform to what the instructor is asking, right? And again, it sort of chips away at this idea of agency and creativity.
Yeah.
Because the idea is disciplining the body, particularly in ballet, where oftentimes students are training to be part of a corps where the ensemble looks identical.
Right.
There's even more limitations put on sort of personal expression. The other piece is that so many people have really fraught relationships with their bodies.
Right.
In part because of the messages that we're constantly fed by in society.
Right.
That women's bodies are the sites for violence.
Mm-hmm.
That men have control over women's bodies.
Mm-hmm.
That women politically have limited control over their bodies.
Mm-hmm.
That there is a certain value to a woman based almost entirely on her physical appearance.
Right. And limited by intellectually physical appearance.
Right. I think of this was like a famous and funny skit that Amy Schumer did on the Amy Schumer show, which was these, really well-established actors, women actors over 40, and they were celebrating, I don't know, it was maybe Julia Louis-Dreyfus's, they were celebrating her last fuckable day. And it's this idea that
right.
women's value is determined by their sexual desirability.
Yep.
And often, these messages essentially translate to a lot of self-loathing that is specifically related to the body.
Mm-hmm.
And I think in terms of your original question about the mental, sort of the mental game, or this idea of learning how to silence an inner critic.
Yeah.
I think sometimes dance training exacerbates because of because we are sort of preoccupied with the experience of the body.
Right.
That we don't address that sort of nearly enough.
Mm-hmm.
For me personally, I think I'm not exactly sure, what the quality I had, whether it was just a sort of dreaminess or, maybe one of the things that I would say about myself personally is that I as a younger person, and even now, this is something I still sort of wrestle with, but I think of myself as I'm a big picture thinker, big picture person.
Yeah.
I'm not always an attention to detail kind of person.
Yeah.
And so I think I didn't often get caught up in the real specificities of that my, this leg is 2 inches lower than it should be. Or, there's this, I think I often was able to sort of cultivate for myself a big picture,
beautiful.
I'm working towards these general goals, but I would not have described myself ever as a perfectionist. And I think that maybe combined with this big picture, this kind of big picture mentality, maybe saved me a little bit sometimes from that.
Definitely.
The harshness of that critical voice in dance. Dance specifically.
Okay.
Again, I think I experienced that in other places in my life where that inner critic was much louder, and unfortunately for me, I wasn't able to translate that confidence or that sort of ability to silence that inner voice, that inner critic, to other places in my life. But when it came to dance, I think I was able to sort of sidestep some of those pitfalls that are often associated with that really harsh critiquing.
Yeah.
I see that happen, though, a lot with my students.
Of course.
In my dance students. I witness it all the time. And, students beyond dance,
right.
I think oftentimes it's especially with students who are new to dance, but they're experts in other things, and they really
Yeah.
find it difficult to be a beginner to learn something new because
Right.
their expectation is that they're going to be excellent at everything they pursue, and we put this pressure on ourselves to really
Right.
deliver it like a high,
Mm-hmm.
you know,
Yeah.
which again, like that motivates great things.
Right. It
It's not that we
does.
shouldn't be searching for excellence, but I think sometimes we confuse excellence in process with excellence in a product.
Mm.
And
Beautiful.
I think that can be hard when it comes to dance.
100%. I mean, I remember like there were moments in our class, and it wasn't necessarily completely out of self-criticism, but definitely out of the self-awareness of that perfectionism or criticism or whatever, where Amy would constantly tell me to try to not stop in something we were practicing, a sequence, choreography, when I got something wrong. Because I would stop, I would laugh at myself, I would be pulled out of that moment. And that point of this was wrong, I stop here, I think is also something that we experience in other parts of our lives, where it's that quote unquote failure, that mistake, whatever, it stops at that. But you were teaching me and encouraging me with it, it doesn't have to stop there. Just because the skirt falls down doesn't mean you need to stop performing.
So true, Lydia. So true. I think there's I think one of the things that we struggle with, and I have to say, I think this is a lot of times related to our relationship again with social media.
Hmm.
But part of our understanding of success is that we like make it through unscathed,
Yeah.
and that success means that we've achieved everything, right? That everything has gone beautifully and perfectly. And I think, for a lot of people, there's an incredible pressure because our lives are so visible in some ways. When we live on social media, or when you can be critiqued on Twitter, for
Right.
a comment that you made in in a moment of distraction, or
Right.
a moment of failing to put your words together in the way that you
Right.
intended. I mean, I think the way that we live our lives sort of visibly and in the public sphere
Mhm.
creates a sense of pressure.
Mhm.
And I think it feels often like the stakes are very high.
Yeah.
And for that reason, folks feel like there's not any room to fail, that
Mhm.
failure is not an option.
Right.
And yet, I'm from the school of thought that failure is the only way for change to happen. My
Mhm.
dad had brain cancer and passed a couple years ago. And before he passed, one of the things that he told me was that we suffer, I was asking him about suffering, and I basically like I was like, why do people have to suffer? Why? Like, I
Mhm.
just don't understand. And he said, humans suffer because that's how we learn about love.
Yeah.
That's how we learn.
Right.
It's one of the most profound ways that we learn. And when we fail, there's a
Right.
lot of suffering and
Right.
failing.
Right.
But that's how we learn to forgive ourselves. It's how we
Yeah.
learn to build resilience. It's how we learn to forgive
Mhm.
other people. It's how we learn to make better choices.
Yeah.
And so I feel like that's all to say that that sense of stopping,
Yeah.
like the moment of stopping
Mhm.
can be transcended.
Yeah.
When we look at it as, okay, this isn't a full stop. This may be a pause. This may be this may be a redirection,
Right.
but this isn't the end of the road.
Yeah. Exactly. Exactly. 100%. I think too, like even as I hear you verbalize some of the problems again with social media, I think, and I mean, it's one of my bigger things of what I'm doing with Reself. I think it's a reflection of our inability to hold space for ourselves compassionately and to hold space for, in 2008, I was a different person than I am in 2021. And that growth is acceptable and I'm allowed to change. I'm allowed to change my mind. I think we also don't maybe we don't talk about the vulnerability of it, putting yourself out there. And again, part of it might just be awareness. We don't necessarily frame social media as being a vulnerable thing. What if we did? Would that help people be more authentic in their expression of themselves versus, putting on this unconsciously even? This is the portrayal of myself that I'm comfortable with other people knowing or understanding. I don't have to participate if I don't like the way this is being played out right now. Um, and
I
I
think there's a huge amount of pressure to present a beautiful, scrubbed, happy,
right,
quote unquote, perfect
right,
image
right,
to the world.
yes,
I think there's an instinct in all of us probably to want to put our best selves
of
out
course.
there, and yet the way that we consume it
Mm-hmm.
starts to trigger
Mm,
in us
right,
this expectation that that is
right,
what the world is.
right.
And when we compare our
Yeah,
realities to what that looks like, it's like, boy, am I a fuck up. Like,
right,
compared to all this other
right,
perfection out there, like,
right.
I am really failing.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's a really dangerous. I mean, I myself have had to go off social
Yeah,
media for that very kind of mindset where I'm like, look at all these amazing lives that people are
right,
living where
right,
there's never a moment of crying. And
right.
I'm just like, I can't compete.
Right. That's why, I mean, I stopped having personal social media when I was a senior in high school. It was more so like I struggled, I felt the disconnect between my reality and my personal expression, and it wasn't productive for anyone, and it just certainly wasn't productive for me. And, you know, I think there's so much to that we can remember and learn and experience without that presence in our lives. But I think, again, part of it is just until we as a society, as social media platforms even, can learn how to re-embody our humanity and the truth of suffering back into it. you know it's Someone just said a quote to me which I thought was brilliant. It also really reflects even what we were talking about self-care being, commercialized. Mental health hasn't been destigmatized, it's been commercialized. And I think that hits so much of it on the head because, again, it's what I'm trying to do with reself. Until we can hold compassion for ourselves, until we can hold space for ourselves, until we can forgive ourselves, how can we be compassionate for others' mistakes? How can we hold space for other people? How can we forgive other people if we can't practice that ourselves? If we don't practice patience with ourselves, how can we be patient in moments where my dog is clawing at my door and I'm trying to do work and I just am losing my mind, or however that expresses for other people. So it's in so many ways technology and social media have been so great for connection. And I think about this a lot too. Growing up in the tri-state and in the suburbs, I had so many bigger pictures for my life than what I was experiencing in reality. And because of the internet, I was able to be exposed to multiple different experiences and lives and
Yeah.
possibilities. And, otherwise we got that through magazines and some sort of documentaries and films or books. But there's a lot of magic to what the internet and technology does. But the until we figure out how to translate humanity onto it,
Yeah.
I think we're going to continue to suffer with it.
Yeah. I agree wholeheartedly. There seems to be there's an imbalance
Yeah.
that 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 exists within it that we haven't figured out how to, as a society. I mean, I think there's many people who have found that balance sort of intuitively for themselves personally,
Right, exactly.
but we haven't found a balance as a society, I think.
Mhm.
And I think we're going to continue to struggle to do that. And the other thing is that technology obviously moves so quickly,
Yeah.
and so much of the technology is sort of at this point out of human hands that it becomes harder and harder, I think, to find those disruption points, maybe.
Yeah, 100%. Something I was talking to my brother about after you and I spoke I was trying to explain your dissertation to him, especially in the context of technology removing humanity and AI and the rate in which technology is, adopted and adapted, is art grows more and more important as a preservation of human essence and expression. And the value of art in societies, especially in our Western society or even specifically our American society, is, and again, maybe it's big picture thinking and even feeding fear, but I think we teeter a line of like, unless we value this now, when push comes to shove and there's some threat to that aspect of our humanity and our human expression, where's it going to go? What's going to happen to it if we aren't valuing it now? Like our environment. I think that's actually a great parallel.
I was just thinking that when you were saying that. I think that speaks to. I agree with you that speaks to a handful of like our great social challenges.
Yeah.
And the environment. It's exactly along the same lines, I think.
Right. It's kind of a great segue. But it brings us to the importance of having these conversations and the importance of talking about art and the role of it in our human experience, whether you're an artist or you consume art and a part of your human essence and expression is, fueled by that. And I think, and there's so much power again in just bringing our conscious awareness to it. How do you see dance in that? How would you define, and I know, okay, there was a quote from your website and you kind of talked about it already, but you said dance sees the meeting of the body, mind, and soul and involves an education of the whole person. So how would you describe dance's role in our human experience and the body, mind, and soul and the evolution of those things?
I think dance serves many purposes. So I'll speak to, and they're all, sort of culturally specific for the person that's interpreting
Totally.
what that is.
Totally.
So I'll speak to my experiences as a maker and an educator, where I am, and again, like in this moment in time,
right?
Dance does, the goal or the hope is that dance does exactly what you are talking about, which is to connect ourselves deeply and fully to our humanity. I'll go back to sort of what we were talking about at the beginning, which is that this happens at both the personal level and the communal level. And the reason that I say that is because I come from sort of a co-constructivist learning philosophy where, a conversation like we're having, this conversation, I'm learning from the conversation because it's you and I having the conversation. It can't be replicated in another format because of who you are and who I am.
Right.
It's the people in the room that are making meaning of the experience. And the people who are hearing this ultimately make meaning of it because of their experiences.
Exactly.
Because they are themselves uniquely.
Yeah.
So when it comes to that experience of embodiment and dancing, the experience is personal and the meaning making is personal. But I also think that with dance, because of this piece of seeing and being seen, and they're being witness to the practice, that there's also this community aspect to it.
Right.
And I'm sure that you felt this at some point or another, because the classes that we had together, it doesn't happen all the time, but there is that sense of like again, sort of the thing that drew me to dance in the first place is just feeling like you're part of something bigger than yourself.
Right.
And when the room is moving together, that's that sense, that community sense of helping each other out, or getting through this difficult thing where we're all sort of unified and working. We're living in the moment.
Yeah.
We're present to each other. We're present to ourselves. There's something really transcendent about that. And I think, for anyone who's not actively engaged in the practice, but who's a witness to it. So if you're consuming culture in the way that you're talking about,
Right.
going to see a performance or watching a company perform, there is still that transmutation, that happens. There's an alchemy that exists between an audience and performer, where the meaning is made because of those people sharing the experience in the room together. And I think that dances can be made about all kinds of things, but the larger perspective, the larger thing that's sort of universal is that there's this shared experience.
Right.
And I think that's maybe the most meaningful aspect of it, is that it's a way for us to hold on to, or to continue to engage that humanity.
100%.
When it's so easy nowadays to not do that.
Right. Right. I think too what you said with the meaning that is created between the audience and the performers, and that experience of value that both bring to the table that creates that alchemy and everything. I wonder if you feel the same almost threat that I feel, where it's when we don't value those things, or when they don't match up to our current value system, i.e., commercialization and money.
Capitalism.
Exactly. Then what happens to them? Because again, I think the environment is a great example where, resources, sure, but when there is no sort of monetary value between my human experience with a tree, with nature, the experience of being present in nature, that symbiotic, alchemy that happens between human and nature, that I think plays a role in our environmental crisis, where it's like the only thing we could value was what we could take. And so, I wonder, do you feel that same threat to dance? Obviously, if you want to speak to just dance, but like dance or art in general.
I do. I think it's naive to think that the way that we live our lives and the way that we prioritize consumption doesn't have an impact on the way that we engage with each other, human to human.
Beautiful.
And I do see that as a threat to the arts at large. The pressures to produce, the commodification of image, and how and it does in many instances come down to resources, and resources are often tied to who has power,
right?
And sort of the preservation of systems that keep some people in power and other people out of power.
Yeah.
And I definitely don't. I have no easy answers to what the solution is. But what I will say is that I think that there will always be. I don't think we've gone so far as to not continue to feel a craving or a hollowness, where A, a connection to nature used to be, and B, where a connection to each other used to be, and C, for a connection to beauty and art used to be. I think we have, as a society, maybe we have pivoted, or maybe we never, some people would argue that we've never prioritized those connections like we should.
Right.
Or at least since the Industrial Revolution, we
Yeah.
haven't prioritized those things as we should. But I don't think humans have gone so far as to not feel sort of in an existential way
Yes.
a desire for those things.
100%.
And I think that desire and that hunger, that internal hunger that drives people to reself, that internal hunger that says, yeah, I need to rethink the way that I'm engaging with social media, or I need to rethink the way that I'm operating in this consumerist environment. Like, right. I need to rethink the way that I think about use and materialism. Like the questions that we ask ourselves, that hunger that we feel, a hunger for beautiful, to witness beauty, to witness art, and to be present with art. I think those things will still, we will still have a hunger for those things, and that hunger, I think, will continue to motivate behavior on some level.
Yeah.
I don't think we've lost that entirely.
100%.
I think and where that hunger exists, there's hope for those things, those other things. There's hope for the things that we are hungering for to exist as well.
Yeah. 100%. Do you think that do you see dance and art becoming more democratized and accessible? Do you think technology plays a role in that at all?
I do. I think it's an interesting time, particularly, COVID has changed the professional performance landscape significantly, and I think it remains to be seen, to frame it in the negative, to like what the fallout is to some of those limitations.
Right.
But I also think that by nature, artists must do the work.
Right.
There's a compulsion, and I use that word in a good way, in the
to
positive, say that artists will be compelled to use all the creativity coursing through their instruments to make, to express what they are born to express. So even despite sort of the limitations and the lack of resources and the lack of opportunities that are kind of permeating the field right now, I think that is also a time for the ferment of new and innovative and creative and exciting things to happen. I think that there's now, with movement, with social movements like the Black Lives Matter movement,
right,
with attention to some of those large-scale social justice movements that address the needs of populations that have been traditionally marginalized, that there is an expansion and a democratization of culture in a lot of ways. I think we're going to continue to wrestle with power and who has power and who doesn't. I think that will continue, in a capitalist society, that will always be sort of front and center, I think, in conversations about who's visible, whose voices are amplified.
Yep.
But I think it's easier than it ever has been to seek out and find artists who represent the diversity of perspectives and diversity of social identities that exist, in our society. And that's a good thing.
Totally.
That's a really good thing.
Totally. There's a self aspect, bring it back to dance. There's an aspect of fulfilling that human desire and expression through dance. But there's also the part of connecting with community. And I wonder if you could just maybe talk a little bit about some of the projects that you work on in terms of linking those two. This was in our jazz class. We did a project, an environmental dance piece.
It was for the climate strike, right?
Yes.
Was that in 2019?
Yes.
Yeah.
I mean, I would love to just hear about how you think the role dance plays in those sorts of community movements and giving voice to something without actually talking.
So one of the most extraordinary things about art is that it makes us feel things.
Right.
You know, a TV show, a movie, a sculpture, a piece of music. Often, the most prominent response to a piece of art is feeling.
Right.
And feeling is a tremendous motivator. I mean, to look at it in the negative, feelings about the most recent election motivated an attack on the Capitol. You know, there was feeling at the heart of that.
Right.
This feeling of being wronged, this feeling of anger. And in opposition to that very thing, you know, art can spark feeling that motivates us to make things better.
Yeah.
And one of the things that I'm keen to do as an educator is to help students or encourage students to look at art through that lens. And one of the things, you know, I think often about, there's the founding director of the School of Environmental Sustainability at the institute where I work, said to me once when we were working on a project on the environment, she said, you know, I'm a scientist and I speak the language of numbers. This is the language that I'm fluent in. But I carry this emotional burden about what we're doing to the planet. And artists speak to that emotional burden.
Yeah.
So we have to work together to make the changes that have to happen. And that's what I see, you know, in my role as an educator and oftentimes as an art maker. That's a place where I can step in and I can use my voice, I can use my power, I can use my body to stand on a line
100%.
and say something of substance with the language that I speak, which is physical.
Yeah.
You know? And so my hope, you know, and a lot of the work that I do with students or in dance making is to lean into that role and to encourage conversations, to encourage action. I think one of the things for me that I'm starting to wrestle with more and more is looking at what the next steps are.
Yeah.
So this building on, you know, it's an idea of building on feeling. So the feeling is important as like the first step, but what is the next step? What is the call to action?
Yeah.
And I've started to, I'm starting to think about that more and more as I kind of again lean into that role as a change maker. You know? And I think that'll be, you know, for me certainly, that'll be kind of the future of some of the work that I try to do.
Yeah.
How do I make functional changes? Help contribute to those functional changes that increase equity and justice via the language that I speak.
Yeah. That's so beautiful and so needed.
We all find our paths, you know. I mean, some of this, like my path was as an artist and a maker and an educator, and I have to discern how to use those tools and skills that I've cultivated and that I was born with to make good.
Yeah.
For anyone who's not a dancer, there's still that pathfinding. And then the same thing, skill development, talent honing, where you learn to use those things to make good.
Yeah. It's a personal choice, but it's not something that we're necessarily taught as we grow up. that whatever your path, whatever you do, you can do good with it and you can create change through it. You don't have to be a politician to make change. You don't have to be fill in the blank. You can be in business and make substantial impact. You can, whatever. I'm curious, and we can go into this very briefly, but it's just something that's been on my mind recently. I know that, of my interest and experience in fashion, and in doing photography, I paint, filmmaking, and even as I see that, all those expressions in the future, and I wonder if you even maybe experience this a little bit in your trajectory of your career as a professional dancer and, where you are now. So much of my own art is escapism or teeters that line. And I wonder what your experience with that is with dance. And I don't know. I mean, I think there's a place for it, right?
For sure. And this is one of the reasons that I said that dance is many things to many people and that I was sort of speaking at this time in this place.
Exactly.
The person that I am right now. One of the most joyful things about dance is entertainment. In the same way that a film is magical because it's entertaining.
Right.
And I think sometimes we sort of poo-poo that whole notion because it feels somehow, again, it feels unimportant, or we value that less somehow in the moral hierarchy of how we use our time.
Right.
Like, if I'm not working 24 hours a day, I'm not making the most of my time.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas I'm like, there's something absolutely fundamentally necessary about being entertained, about taking a break,
right,
about having fun. I mean, one of the joys of life is good food and laughter and song and dance, so like I'm all for escapism, whether through fashion or film or in art in any of its form, through food, through games, I mean, through sport. Like,
right.
I mean, there's a million ways I think that we're humankind. I mean, some of the most joyful aspects of our existence is around those very things.
Yeah.
I also think that within those things, if we look a little, scratching the surface a little bit, we can find deeper meaning. So, like, I think there's, in fashion, I think fashion can be super escapist, but it also speaks to like really deep longings in human existence, or it speaks to representation and what bodies we value. It speaks to consumerism. It speaks to craft. I mean, there's scratch the surface of like a beautiful image, and it provide. I mean, there's a world there to explore beyond just the satisfaction of looking at something beautiful, and I think that's one of the great gifts of art and art making, is that there's often beauty there that can just be accepted at face value for the entertaining and escapist thing that it is. And there are also many, many, many layers to explore beyond that that are equally valuable. I don't think we have to prioritize one thing or, sacrifice one thing for the other. Some of the most politically challenging art I've seen is also hilarious.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think we can hold space, and art itself, can sort of hold those tensions simultaneously. And it's more enjoyable to look at that than maybe read a handbook of statistics on climate change, for example. Like, we feel something, and we are moved by something
Mm-hmm.
in a way, and entertained by something, and that's it's powerful.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you for that. That's been on my mind recently. And I think that, it's such a important reminder, and for myself especially, with philosophy flooding around my head all day long, and people who don't, speak that language, the moral hierarchy in which we exist in as ourselves and as a society, I think there's so much value to having a check with that.
I'm trying to think of this writer and an activist. There's a book. I want to say it's like the pleasure of like activism is pleasure, or pleasure is activism.
Okay.
But the whole idea is that in this philosophically, is that those things are not exclusive.
Yeah.
Being an activist and taking pleasure in your work, or looking for beautiful, enjoying beautiful things, those are not mutually exclusive.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's important to acknowledge those
Right.
those desires, that those multi-layered desires we
Mm-hmm.
have to do good and also to enjoy.
Right. 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 It's the complete range of the human experience, and when we're neck up to one side, we forget the value of all ranges of that experience and making space for that, and how healing and much that allows us to thrive as humans.
Totally. Yeah.
On that note, thank you so much for taking this time to talk to me, Amy.
Lydia, it was such a pleasure. Thank you so much for having me. It was so fun to talk. I'll be thinking about this conversation for a long time.
Same. So grateful for this, and it's, I value these conversations so much, and I'm truly so grateful and honored that you took the time to
Oh my
speak
gosh,
with me.
it was very joyful for me to be here. So thank you for offering me that opportunity.
Of course. I hope you enjoyed this conversation as much as I enjoyed having it with Amy. And I'm so grateful for this medium of being able to share these conversations. Like Amy said, these conversations are special because of who participates in them and what each individual brings. And that is how we make things and create meaning together. And I'm so thrilled to be able to share that creation and that meaning beyond just Amy and me. Thank you for indulging yourself in this. Thank you for nourishing your mind and your soul and being able to possibly have a better understanding of embodiment and connecting with your body and the knowledge of your body through this conversation. Per usual, follow Reself on Instagram, Tumblr, Pinterest, whatever floats your boat. If you haven't yet, feel free to give the podcast a review. Make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss next week's episode. If you would like to participate in Reself's beta test, we are accepting applications until March 1st. Those links will be in the show notes, as well as other things that were referenced throughout this conversation. So check that out. Sending everyone love and light until next week. Bye, everybody.